I will take this land instead of 50 million. Take it. It's useless anyway, said the husband during the divorce. 6 months later, he drove there again just to take a look, and what he saw made him freeze. Before the story grips us completely, write a couple of words about yourself, where you're from, and your age. To me, fool. Everyone who's with me now. Enjoy listening. In the spacious mansion of an elite village near Moscow, there reigned a silence that was thick and heavy, the kind that only exists in homes where people have long stopped talking genuinely, where every word is weighed on invisible scales and most often deemed unnecessary. The marble floors echoed every step with a hollow sound that spread through the empty corridors with high ceilings. Natalie Victoria Parker tried to step softer as she moved through these rooms so cautiously, as if she were an uninvited guest in her own home. Her presence here seemed like an annoying misunderstanding that would be corrected any moment. Andrew Michael Parker, owner of a large construction holding whose name resounded on all major sites across the country, from Kaliningrad to Vladivostok, watched his wife from the window of his office on the second floor, absent-mindedly twirling an expensive pen with a gold nib in his fingers. She was fussing in the garden again, kneeling right on the damp soil after the morning watering, although the gardener, Basil Peter, stood 3 meters away with a shovel at the ready, prepared to do any work at the hostess's first word. Andrew winced and turned away, feeling the familiar irritation rising from somewhere in his chest. Their marriage had happened 15 years ago, when his business was just gaining momentum and every contract came with a fight. The family of the Nikiforovs, who had the right connections in construction circles, opened doors for him to the first serious orders. He married because it was the right thing to do. It was accepted among people of his circle. That's how everyone who wanted to establish themselves in this world and move further did it. Love wasn't taken into account. Andrew generally considered that concept greatly overrated, suitable only for romantic comedies and women's magazines. Now, when his fortune was counted in billions and the surname Parker was pronounced with respectful awe in any office from Moscow to St. Petersburg, he increasingly asked himself the question, why did he need this woman who stubbornly refused to match his new status? Basil Peter, I'll handle it myself, thank you, came her voice from below, soft but with an intonation that allowed no objections. Andrew looked out the window again, setting aside the documents. The gardener, who had worked in the house for 8 years and had long gotten used to the hostess's quirks, spread his hands in a familiar gesture of submission and stepped aside. And Natalie continued to dig in the soil, planting something with the same focused enthusiasm with which other women of her position chose diamonds in a jewelry salon. Natalie Victoria, at least put on gloves. You'll ruin your hands, the gardener asked, with genuine concern in his voice. I don't like gloves, Basil Peter. Through them you can't feel the soil. You don't understand what it needs. Andrew turned away from the window and sat at the massive table made of bog oak, specially brought from Germany. On the laptop screen flickered stock summaries, but his thoughts were far from quotes and indices. In his view, the wife of a successful businessman was a showcase, a business card, a tool for social positioning, a necessary attribute of status. She should appear at events in dresses from famous designers, maintain small talk about fashionable resorts and the latest collections, create the right impression on partners and competitors. But Natalie went to the Danilovsky market herself, on foot or by metro, refusing the driver's services, haggled for bunches of greens, talked for hours with vendors about vegetable varieties and storage methods, exchanged phone numbers with farmers, and jotted something down in a worn notebook that she hid in a dresser drawer. One day, Andrew got stuck in traffic on the Garden Ring and saw her at the market entrance. She was holding a huge paper bag from which green onion tops stuck out, and laughing while talking to some elderly vendor in a colorful scarf. Laughing so sincerely and easily as she never laughed at home. He instinctively lowered the tinted window, then immediately raised it, seized by acute awkwardness. What if one of his business acquaintances saw Parker's wife picking carrots and haggling for dill next to pensioners in worn shoes? That evening, he called her to his office for a serious conversation. Natalie entered silently, as she always did, softly closing the heavy oak door behind her, and sitting on the edge of the leather sofa, folding her hands on her knees in her usual restrained manner. Andrew deliberately leaned on the edge of the table, choosing a position that allowed him to look down at her, as if at a subordinate called in for a reprimand. "Do you understand who you are?" he began without preamble, offering neither tea nor water. "Natalie Nikiforova," she replied calmly, meeting his gaze. "You are the wife of Andrew Parker, owner of the largest construction holding in the country. You live in my house, spend my money, and you must match." "Match what, exactly?" "Look at Helen Serena, at Irene Paula, at the other wives of my partners. They go to exclusive clubs, attend fashion shows and premieres, travel around Europe, dress appropriately for their position. And what do you do? Dig in the beds and haggle at the market for dill like some summer resident from Podolsk?" Natalie was silent for a few seconds, looking at her hands resting on her knees. Under her nails, dark traces of soil still remained. She hadn't had time to wash them properly before the conversation, and now these traces seemed almost defiant to her. "And what have I done wrong?" she asked finally, raising a calm gaze to him. "It's not about what you've done. It's about what you don't do. You don't behave like the wife of a man of my position. You embarrass me with your appearance, your behavior, your habits. You want me to pretend to be someone else? I want appropriate behavior, matching our status." Natalie raised her gaze to him, calm, without challenge or hostility, but also without the submissiveness he expected to see. "I can't pretend, Andrew. Make it seem like I'm interested in these conversations about nothing. Smile at people I don't respect and never will. Wear dresses in which it's uncomfortable to breathe and impossible to take an extra step. Discuss bags and shoes when I want to talk about real things. I don't want to live in a lie." He looked at her with sincere, almost childlike incomprehension, the way one looks at a person who suddenly starts speaking an unfamiliar language in the middle of a business meeting. "Where's the lie? This is called social norms, rules of the game that everyone accepts. For you, it's the norm. For me, it's a cage where there's nothing to breathe." The conversation ended in nothing, as all their conversations in recent years ended. Each remained with their own opinion, and the gap between them only widened. Natalie returned to her occupations, which her husband considered whims and eccentricities, Andrew to his affairs and irritation. But what he didn't know, and couldn't know, was that all these quirks of his wife were part of a carefully thought-out plan that she had been arranging for several years. Conversations with vendors at the market were studies of sales channels and pricing. Work in the garden was agronomic practice, mastering what books couldn't teach. The worn notebook in the dresser drawer was a business plan that she refined and perfected month after month, year after year. Time passed, and Andrew became increasingly irritated by his wife's mere presence in the house. Her quiet steps in the corridor, her silence at breakfast when she concentrated on spreading butter on toast and thought about something of her own. Her hands ingrained with soil. All this caused a dull, aching irritation, the nature of which he couldn't or didn't want to analyze. It was easier to attribute everything to her inadequacy, her inability to match his level. The turning point happened after a corporate event for the holding's top managers and their spouses. They were returning home late. The driver drove the car through nighttime Moscow. Behind the tinted windows flashed the lights of the garden ring, advertising signs and traffic lights, and in the salon hung a silence as dense and stuffy as before a thunderstorm about to break. "At today's meeting I felt it again," Andrew said without turning his head, continuing to look out the window at the passing city. Natalie didn't answer, continuing to examine her own reflection in the dark glass. "Do you hear me? Compared to the wives of my partners, you're just not worth investing in." She slowly turned to him, and in the semi-darkness of the salon, her face seemed like a mask, motionless and impenetrable. "What does that mean?" "It means what it means. You have no money of your own, no connections, no weight in the right circles, nothing. You don't know how to maintain a conversation on the right topics. You don't know what to wear or how to behave. You're nobody, an empty place next to me." Natalie clenched her hands on her knees, but her voice didn't tremble when she asked, "And how much am I worth in your eyes, in that case?" Andrew smirked, shortly and contemptuously, without even thinking about the cruelty of what he was about to say. "A couple of hectares of land, somewhere in the Tula region. Weeds, ravines, and no prospects." She fell silent, turning away to the window. Street lamps outside the glass replaced each other, casting alternating stripes of light and shadow on her face. And in this flickering, it was impossible to read the expression in her eyes. The driver drove the car smoothly, without speeding, pretending to be deaf, as a good driver should in such situations, when the owners sort out their relationships in the back seat. After that night, something broke, finally. Some last thread still connecting them snapped soundlessly. Natalie became even quieter, even more inconspicuous. Now they exchanged only short phrases, necessary for the functioning of common life. "Breakfast is ready. I won't be home for dinner. The bill has come." Andrew returned home later and later, sometimes spending the night in the city apartment, and Natalie never asked where he had been or with whom he spent time. It was convenient for him to consider her resigned, broken by his words and indifference. But behind the facade of this submissiveness, a completely different life was going on. While her husband thought she was crushed and defeated, Natalie was completing years of preparation. She secretly ordered a geodetic survey of her mother-in-law's plot in the Tula region, received soil analysis results from an independent laboratory, refined the business plan with agronomist consultants, conducted cautious negotiations with potential investors, found contractors for utilities, and even concluded preliminary contracts for equipment supply. All she needed now was the land itself, and she knew how to get it. In the spring, they were invited to a closed party at a country club, an annual meeting of owners of large companies and their wives. Missing such an event meant losing face. In the morning, Andrew entered her room, they had long slept separately, and cast a critical glance at the dress hanging on the wardrobe door. "I hope you'll dress decently for this evening." "I'll wear this," Natalie replied, pointing to the beige dress of simple cut, without embroidery, lace, or decorations. "This? Without diamonds? Without something memorable?" He wanted to say something, had already drawn in air for another rebuke, but just waved his hand and left, realizing the futility of any exhortations. At the club, everything unfolded as he had feared, as he had anticipated since morning. The partners' wives shone with jewels, shimmered in silk and satin, discussed new bags worth several million rubles, joint trips to the Azure Coast and Monaco, closed sales in European boutiques, and upcoming fashion shows. Natalie sat among them in her simple beige dress like a foreign body, a shard of some other world incomprehensible to them, accidentally fallen into this sparkling showcase of well-being and luxury. "And where did you vacation this summer, Natalie Victoria?" Helen Serena, the banker's wife, asked her, with condescension in her voice, the kind that society ladies have when anticipating a disappointing answer beforehand. "And the dacha in the Tula region." "At the dacha?" Helen Serena exchanged meaningful glances with the other women, and identical smirks ran across their faces. "How charming and original." The conversation immediately switched to Sardinia, the Maldives, and Monaco, and Natalie was left on the sidelines of the discussion. They no longer asked her about anything. Her rare remarks hung in the air, finding no response, dissolving in the general hum of voices. During lunch, she ended up at the very edge of the long table, covered with a snow-white tablecloth, and the seat next to her remained empty. None of the attendees wanted to occupy it, as if her solitude could be contagious. Andrew watched this from afar, standing with a glass by the fireplace, catching condescending and sympathetic glances from partners, and felt the familiar irritation boiling inside, mixed with shame. Victor Simon, owner of a logistics company, approached him and said quietly so that others wouldn't hear, "Listen, Andrew, you can afford anything and anyone. Why do you need this burden that's pulling you down?" Andrew said nothing, just took a sip from his glass, but his partner's words stuck in his head like a splinter that throbbed all the way home. On the way back, they drove in silence, habitual and dense, impenetrable like a wall. Natalie looked out the window at the passing Moscow region landscapes, birch groves with the first tender foliage, dacha villages with smoke from chimneys, fields with timid spring greenery breaking through last year's grass. Andrew replayed the day's events in his head again and again, returning to the empty seat next to his wife, to the condescending smiles of the wives, to Victor Simon's words ringing in his ears. "I can't do this anymore," he said finally, breaking the silence when the lights of their village already appeared outside the window. Natalie didn't turn, continuing to look into the darkness outside. "Can't do what, exactly?" "Live with you. I'm ashamed of you at every event we attend together, to the point of grinding my teeth, to the desire to fall through the earth." She slowly turned her head and looked at him attentively and scrutinizingly, as if seeing this man for the first time in all 15 years of their life together. "So ashamed?" "Yes," he replied without hesitation, looking her straight in the eyes. "Yes, always." Natalie turned away to the window, and for a few seconds, complete silence reigned in the car, broken only by the soft hum of the engine. Andrew was already prepared for tears, reproaches, hysteria, for anything that's supposed to happen in such cases. But she said completely calmly, so matter-of-factly that Andrew was even taken aback because there was no resentment, no bitterness, no anger in her voice. "Fine. I agree to a divorce." Andrew blinked, caught off guard by such an easy victory, which he expected to fight for months. He looked at his wife, trying to catch, a hidden threat, or at least a hint of bargaining. But her face remained impenetrable and calm, like the surface of a forest lake on a windless day. Only for a moment, for one short instant that could easily be attributed to the play of light from passing street lamps, something strange flashed in her eyes. Not tears, no. Something completely different, like the reflection of a distant bonfire or the first ray of sun breaking through storm clouds. But Andrew, occupied with his own relief, didn't notice it. A few days after that conversation in the car, The spouses met in the lawyer's office in a spacious room with high windows overlooking a noisy street where ordinary Moscow life flowed behind the glass, indifferent to other people's dramas. On the dark wood table lay documents neatly arranged in stacks, and the lawyer, one of those who in 30 years of practice had unlearned to be surprised, meticulously explained the terms of the agreement, running his finger over the points. "The compensation amounts to 50 million rubles," he said, looking alternately at both spouses. "The sum will be transferred to Natalie Victoria's account within 10 business days after signing." Natalie, sitting in the chair opposite Andrew, slowly shook her head. "I refuse the money." Andrew raised his eyebrows in surprise. The lawyer, setting aside his pen, asked again with the intonation that lawyers have when a client says something completely unexpected. "Excuse me, did I understand you correctly? You refuse the monetary compensation?" "Yes. Instead of the money, I want the land," she replied calmly, and there was no hesitation or doubt in her voice. "The plot in the Tula region that belonged to Andrew Michael's mother." Andrew leaned back in his chair, recalling this land. 40 hectares in a remote village 200 kilometers from Moscow, where his mother had once invested money, dreaming of some kind of country estate, but never built anything. After her death, the plot passed to him and turned into a burden, without roads, without electricity, without water supply, overgrown with weeds up to the waist, cut by ravines and swampy lowlands. Land that couldn't be sold at a normal price, couldn't be developed without huge investments, for which he paid taxes year after year and secretly dreamed of getting rid of. "Are you sure of your decision?" The lawyer leafed through the documents, frowning. "According to our data, this plot has practically no market value. It's not included in any development plans for the territory. Infrastructure is absent there." "I'm sure," Natalie interrupted him. In Andrew's head, numbers quickly clicked, adding up to a picture that seemed incredibly advantageous to him. Get rid of the useless land for which he paid taxes every year, and at the same time save 50 million. This was an ideal deal, a gift from fate one could only dream of. "Take it," he said, not hiding a satisfied smile. "All 40 hectares are yours, with pleasure." "Thank you," Natalie replied quietly. Her face remained impenetrable, although something like restrained triumph flashed deep in her eyes. A week later, in the same office, they signed all the documents. Andrew signed sweepingly and almost carelessly, Natalie carefully, tracing each letter with the thoroughness with which one signs something truly important. Her hand trembled for a moment when the pen touched the last page, but she immediately pulled herself together, and the movement came out confident. After signing, they stood facing each other, two people who had lived together for 15 years and had become strangers to each other long before this official parting. "Well then," Andrew said with that formal politeness used when saying goodbye to casual acquaintances. "All the best to you." "And to you," Natalie replied. She took her bag, slung it over her shoulder, and headed to the door. At the threshold, she stopped for just a second, but didn't turn around, simply opened the heavy door and left. The sound of her steps faded in the corridor. That same day, she packed her things in the mansion. There weren't many. Several sets of simple clothes, favorite books in worn covers, a pot with tomato seedlings from the garden, the very ones she had been planting that morning when Andrew watched her from the office window with habitual irritation. No expensive bags, no jewelry, no dresses from famous designers because there had never been any. She didn't buy what she didn't need. For the last time, she went out into the garden and surveyed what she had created with her own hands all these years. Blooming flower beds, neatly trimmed grass, young apple trees that were supposed to bear their first fruits this year. "Take care of them, Basil Peter," she said to the gardener standing aside with his cap removed in his hands. "How will you manage there alone, Natalie Victoria?" he asked with genuine concern. "I'll manage." And she left, without looking back at the house that had never been a home for her. A month later, Andrew's life filled with new colors, bright and juicy, the kind that, in his conviction, should surround a successful person. Work was going uphill, meetings with friends brought pleasure, and most importantly, a new woman appeared beside him, the complete opposite of Natalie in everything. Corinne Marks, 34 years old, marketing director in a large fashion industry company, possessed the ability to exist in the world of luxury so naturally, as if born in it. She knew wines and restaurants, was aware of all the season's fashion trends, easily maintained conversations about contemporary art, real estate investments, and looked so that people turned to look at her on the street, even those accustomed to beautiful women. "Tell me about your ex," she asked one evening in a restaurant when the waiter stepped away after taking the order for a bottle of wine worth half the average Moscow salary. "Nothing special to tell," Andrew shrugged. "She wasn't my style, it turned out completely." Corinne nodded understandingly and shifted the conversation to the planned trip to Milan for Fashion Week. And Andrew once again convinced himself that he had made the right choice. This woman knew the rules of the game and played it flawlessly. Late in the evening, returning after another date, Andrew received a large cardboard box from the guard at the entrance to the village. The sender was listed in the invoice as Parker from the Tula region. She hadn't changed her surname after the divorce. She kept meaning to, but never got around to it, then waved it off. What difference did it make now? He opened the box and found inside fresh vegetables, tomatoes with drops of moisture on the taut skin, cucumbers, bunches of greens, carrots, radishes, all neatly packed and lined with straw so as not to get crushed on the way. Attached to the package was a short note written in a familiar handwriting. "Grown myself. Be healthy." Andrew smirked, imagining Natalie digging in the soil on that overgrown plot, growing her pitiful little garden, an enlarged copy of the garden she had in the mansion. Whatever amuses the child, he thought, carrying the box to the kitchen and instructing the housekeeper to make a salad from it. At the beginning of summer, he and Corinne went to the Maldives, a villa on the water, a private beach, lunches in an underwater restaurant where colorful fish swam behind the glass, yacht rides on the turquoise ocean surface. On the deck, with glasses of champagne in hand under the blinding tropical sun, they looked like a picture from a glossy magazine about the beautiful life. "I'm so happy," Corinne said, reclining on a snow-white pillow. "This is the best vacation of my life." Andrew nodded, but an uninvited thought came. How would Natalie look here? She would probably refuse the yacht, too ostentatious. Instead of champagne, ask for plain water. Instead of the underwater restaurant, prefer to eat on the shore, sitting right on the sand and watching the sunset. Or is she now there, in her Tula backwoods, knee-deep in soil with a shovel in her hands? He shook his head, driving away the uninvited thoughts, and raised his glass again. Natalie was the past. Corinne was the present and future. Everything was right. Everything as it should be. But the thought didn't disappear completely, settling somewhere in the back of his mind like a small, almost imperceptible splinter. 6 months had passed since the divorce when, on one of the autumn weekends, Corinne suggested a drive out of town. "I heard about one place in the Tula region," she said, flipping through something on her phone. "An old estate converted into a boutique hotel. Beautiful landscapes. You can have lunch with a view of the hills. Let's go." Andrew agreed. They got into his SUV and drove along the Simferopol highway, then turned onto a secondary road, and the landscape outside the window gradually changed. Instead of Moscow region cottage villages, fields stretched out, woodlands with yellowing foliage, rare villages. Looking at the navigator screen, Andrew suddenly recognized the area, the names of settlements, and the configuration of roads, and realized they were not far from that very plot. "You know," he said with a laugh, "near here is the land I gave to my ex-wife in the divorce. 40 hectares of weeds and ravines." 40 hectares? Corinne raised her eyebrows in surprise. That's a huge territory. Only on paper huge. In reality, a useless wasteland. Nothing could be built there, nothing grown, even impossible to sell. Who needs land in such a backwater without roads and utilities? Corinne smiled that playful smile he liked so much. Well, let's drive by and see what she's doing with her useless plot. Andrew turned off the main road, expecting to see the familiar picture. A broken dirt track, overgrown fields, maybe some old shed, and a pitiful little garden where Natalie fusses alone. This would confirm his rightness, his foresight, his wisdom in getting rid of this burden along with the useless land. But the road turned out to be different. Instead of a broken rut, asphalt lay under the wheels, fresh, with bright markings. New streetlights and signs stood along the sides. The car climbed a hill, and at the moment they crossed the top, Andrew instinctively slammed on the brakes. The SUV stopped abruptly, rocking on its suspensions. Before him opened a sight he couldn't comprehend, couldn't fit into his head, couldn't reconcile with the picture of the world in which he had lived the last 15 years. The land he had considered a useless wasteland, good only for paying taxes on and dreaming of getting rid of, had turned into a huge agricultural complex stretching to the horizon. Endless fields were neatly divided, and even rows of plantings stretched in parallel lines, geometrically precise as if drawn with a ruler. White greenhouses gleamed in the sun, reflecting light with dozens of glass facets. In the center of the territory rose a modern administrative building, next to which stood warehouses, hangars for equipment, a spacious parking lot with several trucks. An automated irrigation system worked in the distant fields, and sprinklers sprayed water with mechanical precision. Along the road stretched rows of solar panels. The latest agricultural machinery, tractors, combines, seeders, stood by the hangars, glistening with fresh paint. And people, dozens of people in work clothes, labored at their posts. Some harvested in the fields, others worked in the greenhouses. A third loaded crates of produce into trucks, on whose sides large letters spelled out the company, Pure Field. Andrew opened the car door and got out, not feeling the ground under his feet, not hearing Corinne calling his name. He walked forward toward this impossible, incredible sight, and with each step, something collapsed inside him. All his convictions, all his confidence in his own rightness, all his contempt for the woman he had considered a nobody. "Andrew!" Corinne's voice caught up with him, and she was beside him, grabbing his elbow. Is this that same land?" He wanted to answer, but couldn't. Words stuck somewhere in his throat, unwilling to form sounds. Before him was not a pitiful garden farm of a lonely woman. Before him was a full-fledged enterprise, a professional farm with modern infrastructure, built on the land he had given away instead of 50 million, considering himself the winner. Corinne repeated the question, but Andrew couldn't answer because he had no words. Not for her, not for himself, not to describe what was happening now in his head, where everything he believed in was crumbling to dust. From the administrative building came a group of people, 5 or 6 in work overalls, and Andrew, still standing in the middle of the road with the look of a man who had just been hit over the head with something heavy and couldn't come to his senses, mechanically turned his head toward them. In the center of the group walked a woman in simple work clothes, a cap with an embroidered logo of a green ear of wheat and the inscription, "Pure Field." And she was saying something, holding a tablet and occasionally pointing with it in different directions of the vast territory spread around. "Today we finish loading for the Moscow chains. Check the invoices twice. Last time there was a mix-up with the weight." Her voice, clear and confident, reached Andrew in fragments carried by the light autumn wind. "Tomorrow morning, the organic certification inspection arrives. This is important, so prepare all the documentation in advance. I'll check it myself in the evening. And have someone look at the irrigation system in the third greenhouse. There was a glitch yesterday. I don't want that to happen again." "We'll do it, Natalie Victoria, don't worry," replied one of the men, tall and tanned in a work overall with the same logo on his chest, and in his voice sounded not the formal obedience of a hired worker, but real respect, the trust that arises between people doing a common cause and believing in each other. This was Natalie, his ex-wife, the woman he had considered a nobody for 15 years. But this was a completely different Natalie. Not that quiet, inconspicuous woman who for all these years had walked through his house like a shadow, trying not to make extra noise or draw attention to herself. This woman walked across her territory with straightened shoulders and head held high. Her gait was confident, movements precise and economical, presence undeniable, filling the space around. She stopped at one of the greenhouses, explained something to a young guy in a work overall, showing graphs and tables on the tablet, then moved on, carefully inspected the crates of ready produce lined up in rows at the loading platform, made a note on the tablet, and headed to a group of workers loading them into a truck with "Pure Field" on the side. "Is this your ex-wife?" Corinne whispered, approaching Andrew and taking him by the arm. Her voice sounded amazed, almost incredulous. She's a completely different person. This can't be the same woman you told me about." Andrew couldn't tear his gaze away from Natalie, following every movement. How she talked to the workers, how they listened to her instructions, how they nodded and immediately rushed to carry them out. The Natalie he knew, or thought he knew, had never existed. Or rather, she existed but only as a small part of the real Natalie, suppressed and constrained by the framework of his expectations, locked in a cage he himself had built for her out of his own contempt and indifference. A man in a business suit approached Natalie, clearly not a company worker, more like a buyer or investor, judging by the expensive shoes and folder with documents in his hands, and they shook hands, after which they headed toward the greenhouses, conversing animatedly on the way. Natalie showed something on the tablet, running her finger over the screen. The man nodded, asked questions, made notes in his notebook, and from his face, it was clear he was impressed by what he saw and heard. "Maybe we should leave here." Corinne tugged Andrew by the jacket sleeve, clearly feeling uncomfortable. "It's awkward somehow to stand here and watch. We weren't invited." He didn't move from the spot, didn't react to her words. His legs were rooted to the ground, and in his head spun his own words said 6 months ago in the car salon, with that contemptuous smirk he remembered so well. A couple of hectares of land somewhere in the Tula region, weeds and ravines. He recalled his self-satisfaction, his unshakable confidence that he was making a profitable deal, getting rid of the useless land and the useless wife at the same time. He recalled the hundreds of times over 15 years when he looked at Natalie and saw only her mismatch to his expectations, her wrongness, her inadequacy. Slowly, as if in a dream, he returned to the car and sat behind the wheel, not feeling the seat beneath him, not noticing Corinne getting in beside him and saying something in an irritated tone. He started the engine but couldn't drive away immediately. He looked once more in the rearview mirror at the company, at those 40 hectares he had given away so easily and with such joy, at Natalie standing among the workers, confidently pointing something on the tablet, laughing at some joke from one of the subordinates. Now he understood what her quiet "thank you" in the lawyer's office meant, when her eyes strangely sparkled. Returning to Moscow late in the evening, Andrew sent Corinne home by taxi, briefly saying he wanted to be alone. He needed to think. She was offended, her face elongated in displeasure. She even tried to object, to ask what happened, why he was so strange. But he didn't listen, simply called a car through the app, opened the door for her, and waited until she got in, making it clear that the conversation was over and there would be no continuation. In the mansion, it was quiet and empty as always in recent months when he returned here after work or meetings. He went to the office without turning on the light, sat at his massive bog oak table, and stared for a long time out the window at the night sky, studded with stars that you never see from central Moscow, but which here in the suburban village burned brightly and indifferently to the human dramas playing out below. From the bottom drawer of the table, he took out old photographs he hadn't taken out for many years. Wedding ones, everyday ones, some random shots from joint trips they had made in the first years of marriage. In all the photos, Natalie smiled quietly. Not with that luxurious, dazzling smile he expected to see on the face of a successful businessman's wife, but sincerely, softly, and truly happy. He flipped through these photographs one after another and realized with frightening clarity that all these years he hadn't seen the woman standing next to him, sleeping in the next room, sitting opposite at breakfast. Around midnight, when sleep still didn't come, he sat at the computer and began searching for information, typing into the search bar, "Pure Field Company, Tula region," and not knowing what to expect. And he found much more than he could imagine. Articles in business publications about a new model of sustainable agriculture, written about as an example to follow. An interview with Natalie in an agrarian magazine, where in the photo she stood in the middle of her field, tanned and smiling that very smile, in work clothes and a cap with the logo. Mentions of contracts with large retail chains for the supply of organic vegetables. Plans for expansion. Awards at agricultural exhibitions. In one interview, she said, "I prepared for this for many years, long before I got this land. I studied agronomy, compiled a business plan, sought investors, talked to farmers at markets. When I finally got this land, I knew what to do with every hectare." Land is not just a plot on a map. It's an opportunity. You just need to learn to see it. And he hadn't seen it. He looked for 15 years and saw nothing but his own prejudices. A week later, on the next weekend, Andrew went to the Tula region again, alone, without telling anyone, without warning Corinne or his secretary. He parked the car at the entrance to the company's territory and walked on foot along the new asphalt, examining the fields, greenhouses, workers in branded overalls bustling about their business. No one paid special attention to him, taking him for another visitor or potential buyer, of whom there were apparently many here. Near the administrative building, Natalie noticed him. She stopped mid-step, looked at him calmly, without surprise, without hostility, without any excitement, simply stating the fact of his presence on her territory. "Why did you come?" "I wanted to see you. To talk." "You already saw me last week. I knew you came." Andrew was taken aback, not expecting such a turn. "How?" "This is my land, Andrew." She smiled slightly at the corners of her lips. "I know everything that happens here. Cameras, security, surveillance system. Your car was noticed even on the approach to the farm." They walked across the territory, and Natalie showed him the greenhouses with automatic irrigation and climate control systems, fields with plantings stretching to the horizon, the warehouse of finished products where workers packed crates with vegetables for shipment to Moscow. She explained, without boasting, without a desire to impress, simply stating facts. How many tons of harvest they collect per season, what contracts are signed for the next year, what plans for production expansion. "I was wrong," Andrew said finally when they stopped at the edge of a field where rows of cabbage and carrots stretched to the horizon, lost in the autumn haze. Then, in the car, those words about hectares of land, about weeds. "You didn't understand me," Natalie replied, looking not at him, but at her fields, at the work of her life. "And you didn't try to understand." "Not once in 15 years. Yes, I didn't try. I admit it. I wasn't small, Andrew. I was never small. It was you who made me small, with your attitude, your contempt, your indifference. In your eyes, I was a function that didn't work right, an attribute of status that didn't meet the requirements, not a person." He didn't argue, because it was the truth, and they both knew it. "Are you happy now?" he asked after a long pause, during which they silently looked at the fields, at the workers in the distance, at the sky covered with light clouds. And then Natalie smiled that smile he had never seen in all the years of their marriage, sincerely and calmly, glowing from within with some quiet, deep light. "Very happy. For the first time in my life, I'm doing what I love, what I've been heading toward all these years, and it brings benefit to people." She told him she had been preparing for this from the very beginning of their marriage, from the first months of living together when she realized he would never accept her real self, that all those years of trips to the market, which he considered eccentricities, work in the garden which irritated him, endless conversations with farmers and vendors were not the quirks of a bored housewife, but systematic preparation for the future she saw so clearly. She had been gathering information, building plans, refining the business plan in that worn notebook she hid in the dresser drawer. And he hadn't seen any of this, because he didn't look, because he didn't consider it necessary to look. "I want to expand further." Her eyes lit up with the fire that people have when they've found their true calling. "I'm eyeing the neighboring plot, another 20 hectares. The owner is ready to sell. I plan a fruit orchard, apples, pears, cherries, and agritourism, so that city dwellers can come for weekends, relax in the fresh air, learn to grow vegetables with their own hands, feel the soil." Andrew listened, nodded, and understood with absolute clarity that these two would never be together again, and that perhaps they had never truly been together, just lived under one roof for 15 years, without seeing or understanding each other. Natalie wished him health, firmly shook his hand in farewell, and returned to work. And he watched her go. Straightened shoulders, confident gait of the owner of this land. Workers immediately approaching her with questions and tablets in hand. She was in her place. She was home, for the first time in her life. After that meeting, Andrew began to change. Slowly, imperceptibly to those around him, but deeply and irreversibly inside. He started looking differently at people in his company, noticing what he hadn't seen before. He learned that the chief engineer's mother was seriously ill and helped pay for treatment in a good clinic. He noticed the talent of a young architect who timidly showed him his project and gave him the opportunity to implement the idea on one of the sites. He learned to listen to what people told him, not just give orders. He broke up with Corinne a month later. The conversation was short and honest, without dramas or scandals. "I'm not ready for a serious relationship. Not now. Maybe not soon." She was disappointed, indignant even, but accepted his decision, understanding that arguing was useless. A month later, she had another wealthy admirer, and Andrew, learning about it accidentally from mutual acquaintances, felt nothing but light relief. He remained alone in his huge mansion, and for the first time in a long time, didn't feel loneliness. On the contrary, he felt a strange freedom from the need to meet someone's expectations. From time to time, news about Natalie reached him. The Purefield farm continued to grow. New greenhouses appeared, new contracts, awards at exhibitions, mentions in the press. She was invited to conferences on sustainable development, interviewed for business magazines, called the new face of Russian organic farming. He read these news, finding them on the internet, and smiled, not bitterly, but with recognition, with respect, perhaps even with gratitude for the lesson she had unwittingly given him. On one of the late autumn evenings, Andrew stood at the window of his office in the Moscow headquarters on the top floor, looking at the panorama of the falling asleep city. Skyscrapers with lit windows, an endless stream of cars below on the garden ring, gray sky over the roofs illuminated by advertising lights. Somewhere there, 200 kilometers to the south, Natalie was now walking her fields in the thickening twilight, checking the greenhouses before the night chill, planning the next season, dreaming of a fruit orchard and agritourism. Happy, confident, real. "Take care of yourself, Natalie," he said quietly into the emptiness of the office, and the words dissolved in the evening silence. And he returned to work, to the documents on the table, to unread letters, to tomorrow's meetings. But now he was a different person. Now he looked at the world differently, noticing what had previously passed by his attention. Now he understood that the true value of a person is measured not by money or status, not by expensive suits or membership in exclusive clubs, but by what he carries inside, by what his soul burns with. And that sometimes you need to lose something truly important to learn to see it.